In the winter of 1385, an old man was dragged into a cell in the castle of Trezzo Salada and left there to die slowly on the orders of his own nephew. He had ruled Milan for 31 years. He had married off his daughters to kings. He had forced 2 ambassadors from the Pope himself to eat the letter of their own excommunication, wax seal and silk cord included, rather than let it touch his hands. And decades earlier, he had helped design a punishment so methodical, so deliberately drawn out, that the men sentenced to it were kept alive on purpose, fed and rested, just so the suffering could start again the next morning. He named it after Lent. 40 days, the same number Christ spent in the desert. Except instead of fasting and temptation, the condemned man spent his 40 days being taken apart, one piece at a time. This is the story of the Quaresima and the brothers who built it into law. Milan in the 1350s was not a peaceful place to hold power. The city belonged to the Visconti family, a dynasty so notorious for cruelty and backstabbing that other Italians simply called them the Vipers, after the coat of arms that showed a serpent swallowing a man whole. In 1354, the family's ruling archbishop died, and lordship of the city split 3 ways between his nephews, Matteo, Bernabo, and Galeazzo. Within a year, Matteo was dead too, poisoned, most historians believe, by his own brothers over a dish of quail. That left 2 men in charge. Bernabo took the east. Galeazzo took the west. And between them, they wrote the rulebook for what happened to anyone who crossed them. Bernabo was the more feared of the 2. He fathered at least 15 children with his wife, and reportedly even more outside of it, and used every one of them as a bargaining chip, marrying daughters into royal houses in France, Austria, Bavaria, Cyprus. His palace, one visitor said, looked less like the home of a Christian prince and more like the seraglio of a sultan. He taxed his subjects into the ground to fund a private army and an obsession with hunting dogs so extreme that peasants across his territory were legally required to help feed and house them. When the Pope excommunicated him for the second time and sent legates to deliver the formal decree, Bernabo had the 2 men arrested on the spot and refused to release them until they had swallowed the entire document, parchment, lead seal, and all. Galeazzo, his brother, wore a gentler mask. He was a patron of the poet Petrarch. He founded a university. He arranged one of the most extravagant royal weddings of the century, marrying his daughter to an English prince with a feast so enormous that the leftovers reportedly fed 10,000 people. But underneath the culture and the diplomacy, Galeazzo carried the same instinct his brother did. And together, somewhere in that first decade of shared rule, the 2 of them designed the Quaresima. Here is how it worked. A man condemned for treason, for conspiracy, for defying the Visconti in any serious way, was not simply executed. He was sentenced to 40 days. On the first day, he was tortured. Eyes were gouged out. Noses, lips, and ears were sliced away. Limbs were removed, not all at once, but one at a time, over the course of the sentence, so that a man might survive the loss of a hand only to know a foot was coming next. The rack stretched joints until they separated. The strappado bound a prisoner's hands behind his back and hoisted him by them, dropping him again and again until his shoulders tore loose from their sockets. The wheel broke bones in a pattern designed to maximize pain and minimize the chance of a quick death. And then, after each session, the torture stopped. For 1 full day, the prisoner was left to rest. Wounds were allowed to close just enough. Strength, however small, was allowed to return, because the entire point of the Quaresima was that the sentence had to last 40 days. A prisoner who died on day 12 had escaped his punishment early. That was not acceptable. So the state gave him a day off, and then came back for him again. Historians who study medieval Milan point out something darker still. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't a mob or a single furious executioner. It was a formalized legal protocol, written down, applied to state enemies as official punishment for treason. The Visconti brothers didn't invent torture. Every court in Europe had some version of it. What they invented was pacing. A torture regime engineered with real administrative precision to stretch a single man's suffering across an entire season. It's worth pausing on the man who helped build this, because Bernabo Visconti was not a simple monster acting purely on impulse. When the Black Death swept through northern Italy in the following decades, Bernabo did something almost nobody else in Europe thought to do. He ordered infected people isolated outside the city, refusing entry to anyone showing symptoms of plague. Historians consider it one of the earliest documented uses of organized quarantine, a policy that measurably reduced how hard the plague hit Milan compared to its neighbors. The same mind that designed a 40-day torture calendar also designed one of history's first public health interventions. Cruelty and calculation in Bernabo were never far apart. He didn't punish out of chaos. He punished, and he protected with the same cold, methodical planning. That precision defined his entire reign, right up until it turned on him. By the 1380s, Bernabo had outlived his brother Galeazzo by nearly a decade and ruled Milan almost as an emperor unto himself, feared by popes, courted by kings across Europe who wanted his daughters for their sons. But Galeazzo had left behind a son of his own, Gian Galeazzo, quiet, bookish, largely dismissed by his uncle Bernabo as harmless, a man who preferred his university at Pavia to the battlefield or the throne room. On the 6th of May, 1385, Gian Galeazzo invited his uncle to meet him just outside Milan, telling him it was a pilgrimage of thanks for surviving an illness. Bernabo rode out with a modest escort, suspecting nothing from the nephew he'd spent years underestimating. It was an ambush. Gian Galeazzo's soldiers seized him on the road, stripped him of command of the city in a single afternoon, and marched him off to prison in the castle at Trezzo. He was never tried. He was never sentenced to 40 days of anything. He was simply held, quietly, for a little over 7 months, until he died in his cell that December, almost certainly poisoned on his nephew's orders. No public spectacle. No rack, no wheel, no ceremony stretched across 40 carefully rested days. Just a locked door and a slow, silent end, arranged by the one relative he'd never bothered to fear. And the nephew who arranged it didn't abandon his uncle's methods, either. Once in power, Gian Galeazzo kept the Lenten treatment in his own arsenal of statecraft, alongside a taste for having prisoners torn apart by hunting dogs. The system Bernabo and Galeazzo built together outlived the men who built it. Milan's rulers had learned that terror, applied patiently and on a schedule, was a tool too effective to retire. The Quaresima disappeared eventually, the way most instruments of medieval terror did, replaced by newer, quieter forms of state control. But for a few decades in 14th century Milan, cruelty had a calendar. Suffering was scheduled, rationed, and renewed, all so that a message could be delivered slowly enough for an entire city to watch it happen, day after day, for 40 days straight. The men who wrote that calendar believed their power made them untouchable. One of them found out, in a locked room in Trezzo, that it never does.